What's up, guys? We are in the second week, really our third week, but just over 2 weeks of world history, and we have covered time skills, how to read a map, a timeline, BC versus AD, and we've moved into the Neolithic era with the melting of the ice and the formation of the land and how that land is turned into agricultural, systematic farming and production, and the early formation of river civilizations, the popping up of civilizations on rivers, um, because those rivers provided much needed nutrients when those rivers flooded. And then, of course, transportation and, of course, water for irrigation. Um, and we kind of went over, how what allows for a civilization to exist, and the number one reason that people were able to congregate into one area and to not have to travel and hunt and gather anymore was food surplus. By having food surplus through farming, systematic farming, civilizations popped up and were able to become very stable, very complex, so much so that these civilizations had massive cities and city-states within these civilizations that had their own customs and beliefs and whatnot. We talked about barter trading, like a barter economy, where people were trading items for items, and because they were trading items for items to make money, if you will, you had cultural diffusion. As they were trading these items, they started talking about their customs, their beliefs, the things that they were wearing, jewelry, things like that, which leads to a diffusion of culture and a diffusion of ideas. Diffusion means movement, a movement of ideas. And so I think we mentioned on the last video notes that Mesopotamia had, five major civilizations that popped up in that land between two rivers. Don't forget, Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers, and the two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which would be present day like Iraq, present day Syria, that area in the Middle East. But we wanted to talk about, or what I had mentioned to you guys, was the civilizations that popped up in that Mesopotamian region, and there were basically five or six if you include the Chaldeans that popped up in the Mesopotamian region. You had the Sumerians, or the civilization of Sumer. The people were called Sumerians. You had the civilization of Akkad, and the people that lived there were called the Akkadians. You had the Babylonians, Babylon. That's the third one. The fourth one would be the Chaldean Babylonians, or the Chaldeans. I'm sorry. The fourth one is the Assyrians, the civilization of Assyria. And then you had the Chaldean Babylonians, or the Chaldeans. And then lastly, a very, very complex, a very tolerant, and a very successful civilization called Persia, the Persians. And so the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and then it ended with the Persians. So six civilizations that popped up in that Mesopotamian region that we will cover and kind of end our early river civilizations unit on those six. What I want to primarily focus on today is Sumer. The first one's the Sumerians, and kind of like their contributions and the things that they did, how they made money, and a little bit, of their cities. Their massive main city that was a very complex city-state was Ur. They had to protect themselves. Obviously, when we talk about six civilizations in that Mesopotamian region, you have to ask the question, why six? Why didn't one just survive? And the answer is, one attacked the other one and won, and then they got attacked, and then they got attacked. So, you go through your progression. The Sumerians obviously got attacked and overthrown by somebody. But all of these civilizations for defense systems would build huge walls for protection. They were all subject to massive weather patterns and vicious weather. They were sitting between two rivers, so you had flooding all the time. So they were always subject to failure or tragedy or devastation because of the weather patterns and, of course, the flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which was extremely unpredictable. The positives, though, of living on those rivers were obviously water irrigation for their farms and for their agriculture that they had. And of course, that being said, the number one way that the Sumerians made money was that they produced agriculture. It was based on farming. It was definitely a farming, economy. Barley, wheat. Of course, there were some fish involved because they did live on a river, so they were able to make money off of fish. But they would trade those items. They would barter those items with other civilizations in the region, and of course, again, that led to cultural diffusion. We talked about many characteristics. I think there were like 6 characteristics that we talked about that defines a civilization. And then one of those is religion. The Sumerians were polytheistic. They did not believe in one God. They believed in many gods. And that is the word polytheism or polytheistic. If you believe in only one God, that's called monotheism or monotheistic. But the Sumerians were definitely polytheistic. The priests and the preachers in the Sumerian religion were very powerful people. You'll learn that way back in the day, if you were a priest, you had quite a bit of power and notoriety within your community, within the civilization. But they believed that the gods ruled over their civilization. They were a pretty gloomy religion, meaning when you died, a lot of their religion was based on the weather, and because the weather was unpredictable and sometimes negative, bad weather, their outlook on life and their religion was pretty gloomy. They believed that upon death, when you died, you would go to a place called the land of no return. They called it the underworld. So it was pretty gloomy ending. On their prediction and in their belief in life. They definitely had a temple. I know, like some of us go to church in our religion. They had a church, if you will, or a temple. It was called a ziggurat. It's Ziggurrat, Ziggurrat. That was their place of worship, their temple. It was a very powerful area in the city. It was usually located right smack in the city, center of the city. And around that ziggurat, they would have all types of trading. So it was a very active place in the city that had a lot of economic things going on around it, and a lot of politics going on around the ziggurat. It was absolutely the most important, place in the city. They were very beautiful. Their structure and their art was complex, but that kind of gives you an outlook on the Sumerians, the first civilization in Mesopotamia. So we'll talk about the other 5. We'll go into the other 5 civilizations in the next video lecture series. So we'll talk about the Akkadians, and the Babylonians, and the Assyrians, and the Chaldeans, and then the Persians. But that'll end this. Continuing on in our video lecture series on the Sumerians, I wanted to talk about, we left off with the ziggurat and the temple that was located primarily in the middle of the city-state. Wanted to talk about kind of the structure of the society and the people that lived in Sumer. Like, what was your social status, as we call it? And it was basically divided into 4 levels. At the very top, and there was only one, it was the king. Underneath that, you had the nobles. Not a whole lot of nobles. It was mainly your priests, royal officials, and their families. Underneath that, the third and the most, one of the most common was a group called the commoners. It made up 90% of the people. It was farmers. It was your everyday workers. Maybe people that worked in the church, merchants, people that sold stuff, fishermen. And then at the very bottom of the social structure was the slaves, and they worked on the fields and the farms and the structures of the city. Of course, the kings at the top, they were divine. They were in control of all of the military and all of the armies. They oversaw the entire city, the buildings, the social structure, any projects that were going on in the city. Underneath them, the nobles mainly were made up of priests, and they kept all the records, if you will. The priests in the ziggurat kept records of the city. They kept the calendar, the farming patterns that were going on. In other words, best time to plant, best time to harvest. They definitely had, the priests would have scribes, S-C-R-I-B-E-S. The scribes wrote down everything so that they would have a memory and a history to pass on in the future. The scribes kept records of everything: unnatural events, natural events, sicknesses, disease. Of course, if you wanted to make a copy of that, you would have to rewrite the whole thing out. Scribes were very high in rank. They were educated. They were considered, if you will, upper class. The way that they wrote was a style called cuneiform, Cuneiform. So the Sumerians used a style of writing called cuneiform, and they wrote on clay tablets. They used pens, if you will, but the pens were really reeds. But the style of writing would lead to a lot of their styles of writing would lead to poems. But one of the most epic poems ever written was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which it's one of the oldest poems ever written, and it's a Sumerian tale about a hero. Most of the old tales and writings were of heroes, not so much villains, but definitely heroes in their civilization. And Gilgamesh, was a hero in the Sumerian civilization. But the first and one of the major inventions the Sumerians gave us was the wheel, mainly used on the potter's wheel. So if you've ever seen a potter's wheel where you would put clay on it, and you could pedal it and it would turn and spin a disc so that you could form clay. So they formed the wheel. They were one of the first to be able to shape and use copper to make tools. They used the sundial, which some people still use today to be able to tell what time of day it is. They were one of the first to use astronomy and be able to read the stars. They used a math number, the system of 60 with math. And I think we've already talked about the system of 60, like 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and things like that. They definitely used geometry in mathematics. They were one of the first to form an architectural formation called an arc. Y'all know what an arc is, but an arc to form buildings or parts of buildings. But the Sumerians gave us many contributions, from astronomy to math to copper to cuneiform, the first style of writing, to the oldest poem ever written, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But again, these were all written down by scribes, which worked for priests, and they were very high ranking and they were very educated. So that's quite a bit of information about the Sumerians. So that should give you a pretty good understanding of who they were, what they did, how they made money, and how they lived their life.